Good morning, it's Harry Brook here, Ag Fieldman for Flagstaff County, and today we're talking to Doug Macaulay, who is the manager of Ag Service Boards as well, wears another hat as the provincial entomologist, although we're not going to be talking about bugs today. We're talking about the Ag Service Board.
You're listening to the official podcast of Flagstaff County.
So Doug, do you want to give me a brief history of how the Ag Service Boards came about and what they do?
You bet. And I can go back a little bit in time here because things happened in Alberta that led to us going down this road. So it goes all the way back to the Dominion Lands Act in 1872. And we saw a real push to bring folks out to Alberta at that time. And basically folks were able to access land if they could get it into production within, I think, a few years, if I remember right. And so we had all kinds of folks starting to migrate from all over the world to Alberta. And they were getting free farms, 160 acres is how they were advertising it, and just really getting a big boom out in Western Canada, especially in, I guess we could call it central Alberta, so Flagstaff country and neighboring counties. As they worked their way out here, certainly we got more and more people definitely coming on by railway. And this period of time called kind of the land rush created by this act was between about 1872 and 1931. So our population exploded during that period of time where we went from around 100,000 people to almost 800,000 by the end of the 30s. So significant growth, and most of these folks were coming here to farm. So as folks started to arrive here in the later years of this land rush, farm equipment started to become more mechanized. And so you had thrashing machines and all irrigation expansion, seeding, plows, tractors, all this good stuff, right? So more land could be opened up, farms were getting larger, lots of technological advancement, and production per acre was going up. And the southern region obviously started to really boom because irrigation started to appear on the scene. So just to recap, the good times were really in the 1920s is when we really saw a lot of advancement and technological advancement and the big boom of people. And we got out of the First World War, so everybody was really optimistic. The establishment of irrigation was happening around this time too in the 20s and all that technology. So real huge growth and expansion of the ag sector in Alberta at that time. So then, as everybody knows, with all good things, there comes a bump in the road. And in this case, a tremendous bump. And that was the world market crash in 1929, which also included really low commodity prices. So that a real bust in that condition, as well as lots of crop failures, which was caused by drought conditions that seemed to prolong forever. And I'm sure you've all storms, yeah. And so real tough times. And you saw a lot of people really struggling to farm. Basically, it sets the perfect conditions for things like weeds and other pests. And so these really started to get a foothold in these ag regions of the province, along with folks losing everything and leaving their farm businesses behind them, right?
Was that when the peace block was opened up as an alternative?
So, interestingly, and we're going down a little bit of a road here, by
rabbit trail.
Wife's grandfather, who's still around, he's 96 now, said that during the 30s, he was still cutting down trees up in the Peace Country where they migrated to. So it didn't impact the north quite as severely as it did in the south, because there really wasn't a drought in the Peace Country
Great.
during the 30s that he was aware of at that time. But certainly in that Stettler country and southern Alberta, it was hitting really hard. And that's where my ancestors were, and they left and went to Edmonton. So yeah, weeds started to really spread. Soil issues were horrendous. Definitely grasshoppers were having a feeding frenzy. And
That old days.
so municipalities were actually inheriting a lot of this land, right? And as things started to improve, they needed a way to attract people back to their communities. And so during the early 40s, they thought of some ideas, and really the province was, though we had a DA in all these municipalities at the time, a district agriculturist, the province was still just didn't have the same resources that the municipality had to deal with these issues. So they came up with this idea, the MD of Conrich and I believe the MD of Red Deer at the time, to pilot a program where they would take some really good farmers from the area and develop this philosophy where the municipality would have more control over reclaiming some of this land that was in really rough shape. So power would be given directly to the municipality to take on this reclamation role and work to make their municipalities more attractive to producers and bring them back. And so that's where the idea of the Ag Service Board Act began. And so in 1943, they piloted this program.
Yeah.
And so they had 2 counselors, 2 farm members, and a DA on the Ag Service Board. They received about $1,000 of funding from the province for their board. And with that money, they would hire staff to implement some of this programming. And it was a real success. And basically, after they piloted it for a couple of years, they developed this legislation called the Ag Service Board Act, and that came into fruition in 1945.
And the purpose was?
To give power to Ag Service Boards to basically enforce legislation around weed control, pest control, and also they had the power through that legislation to take on ownership of land and reclaim it. And that was the big piece of the legislation. So we started seeing after 1945 a real growth in the amount of land that the municipalities were managing and reclaiming. And
no, you mentioned Conrich, and I'm just wondering, did we have municipalities like Saskatchewan at that time where they were just all small and centered around local towns?
Yeah, pretty much. They were named after the community that was sort of the bustling community in the surrounding farm or within the surrounding farmland. And so Conrich was Rocky View area, I believe, and Red Deer obviously became Red Deer County over the years.
So when did they get amalgamated into counties?
I think we started seeing counties appear in sort of the 1970s and 80s where they would, and we still have some MDs, though I think the legislation has changed a bit so that MDs and counties are very similar in nature. But back then, I think it was, if you were an MD, you got a little less money than you did if you were a county and you had a lower population. But so the legislation came into play, and it basically delegated authority for those, the Pest Act, the Soil Conservation Act, the Weed Act, as well as tied them to the Animal Health Act. And the model has really worked. And 75 plus years later, we have 69 ag service boards across the province and over 800 staff working with ASBs, and a real strong mix of young people, right? When I visit municipalities now, I'm just amazed where this is where all the young people are working, right? As for counties and municipalities. And yeah, it's worked really well. It's helped us have the most robust pest surveillance system in all of Canada. We are the
Wow.
only place in Canada that has ag service boards.
Mm-hmm.
And if you watch some of the mapping that tracks the spread of disease and pests, you can actually see when you hit the Alberta border, things change.
Oh, yeah.
And so the work they're doing, and we have no rats, right? Which was the other big thing that came into play in sort of the early 40s is the ASBs took on rat control. And we know that huge success there, and to the point where we have no rats in Alberta at all. So
now some of the other duties of the Ag Service Board are a little vaguer, aren't they? Because it's basically to promote the health of the agricultural industry and the agricultural communities.
yeah, good point, Harry. So it's not all about weeds and pest control. They are also promoting that and lobbying for the economic sustainability of the ag industry, right? So if there's something that's an obstacle for the success of agribusinesses, ASBs pipe up, right? And they pass resolutions, which is another big piece of what ASBs do, right? Is they are policy developers and policy influencers. And they're actually the legislative advisors both to council as well as to the minister. And so they
Pretty
have
good system, actually,
yeah,
to get grassroots concerns all the way up to the top.
yeah. And ASBs are specialists in basically everything agriculture, right? And nowadays we have councils that may not have that ag expertise. And so ASBs become a real important piece to them because they can appoint board members that are farmers that aren't necessarily council, and to be those ag experts for the council and advise them and develop policies around ag.
I also find it interesting too that there's a real move over the last 30, 40 years, I guess, towards almost environmental bent.
Yeah, so that's related to the public trust side of things, right? And yeah, farmers have always been great stewards of the land, but this has allowed them to really bring that to the forefront, right? To talk about all the great things they're doing, and then also to do more projects around grazing management systems or riparian protection, technologies around like solar watering. I think direct seeding was a big deal when they switched from conventional cultivation to low disturbance farming, right?
I actually remember those days when I was a DA doing that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and now almost every farm in Alberta is using direct seeding, right? So
right. Well, it makes sense. It's certainly conserves moisture.
yeah, and ASBs were a big part of that, right? So promoting
Yeah,
it.
they were in like dirty
departments.
shirts. Sometimes they were buying machinery. Even I remember Vermilion River bought a Victory air seeder to demonstrate it and bring in other demonstrations to show people some of the other tools out there. That was.
Yeah, when I started in the early 2000s, everybody was talking about switching over, right? And I think we had probably 60-70% of farmers were switched over. And now you're the odd person if you're into conventional cultivation. Yeah, big changes have happened.
Yeah, and I imagine it'll continue to evolve as time goes on.
Yeah, you bet.
Anything else you want to talk about the Ag Service Boards, or shall we move into the second part?
Yeah, I think this would be a great spot for Gayah to jump in and talk on the Ag Pest Act and the Weed Act.
Okay.
More detail.
Well, thank you, Doug. And now we're going to be talking to Gayah Sieusahai, who is the Pest Regulatory Officer with Alberta Agriculture. He is responsible for the Pest Act and the Weed Act. So, since weeds are always a problem, I think we need to talk about that first. So tell us about the Weed Act.
Thank you, Harry, and thanks, Doug, for that great introduction. So with the Weed Act, the purpose of the Weed Act is to prevent the introduction and spread of highly invasive plant species from coming into Alberta. And these weed species are highly invasive because they have multiple ways of spreading. Lots of them produce a lot of seed. Some of them have a perennial lifestyle. Some of them have forms and different mechanisms where they spread. So, and the Weed Act, it was proclaimed in 2010, but this, the new one, but it's been around for a long time. The Weed Act has been around since 1907, so it's nothing really new. The major update was in 2010 when 2 new classes of weeds were introduced: prohibited noxious weeds and noxious weeds.
And they got rid of the nuisance weeds, didn't they?
Yeah, the nuisance section was gone. So the idea with the prohibited noxious is they are either here in small quantities or they are not here. So we're trying to keep them out. Or if they're in small patches, trying to get rid of them. So the idea here is to destroy a prohibited noxious weed, because once it starts spreading, you just maintaining it, it's really hard to actually destroy it and get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
So municipalities and local landowners have a responsibility to prevent the spread of these prohibited noxious weeds. So if they're seen, they have to be destroyed. The other type of weed are the noxious weeds, and they are things like your common tansy, things like that, yellow toad flax, other weeds that are present in the province. But if they spread, they can cause economic hardship to local farmers. If you have Canada thistle, it can cause a lot of problem. And if a neglectful farmer or producer has thistle or some other noxious weed and it's allowed to spread on someone else's land, then it can be a big problem. So
oh, tell me about it. We've got a lot of leafy spurge. It's the gift that keeps on taking.
Yeah, and that one is a really hard one because the root system goes quite deep and it's really hard to take care of. And there's another thing on the Weed Act too. Municipalities can add weeds that are not on the regulations. So if there's a problem weed in your area, the municipality can elect to add that weed on a bylaw. The bylaw gets a reading at the local level and then the minister approves it, and then it becomes as if it's part of the regulations. So if it says, if the municipality puts it as a prohibited noxious, then it has to be destroyed wherever it's found in the municipality. So the municipality has that option to add weeds onto their act.
Well, we've got one actually in our county, which is absinthe wormwood.
Right. Yeah, I remember seeing that one come across our desk. Yeah, just bear in mind though, a municipality cannot remove something that's in the regulation instead of making a bylaw that we can't control something.
You mean they can't throw their hands up and say, we can't do anything?
Right, or they can't de-elevate. So let's say something is prohibited noxious, they can't say, oh, we want it as a noxious weed. So those are the kind of things. So municipalities, they do have inspectors, weed inspectors. They're appointed by the local authority, and they can do look for weeds in their municipalities, and they can do take samples, do enforcement, things like that in the municipality. Now, if there's a smaller municipality close by that doesn't have resources, they can do a joint authority.
Oh,
so
yeah.
the municipality can go and help the smaller municipality in their weed control program.
Well, I was just thinking there was a recent example of a prohibitive noxious weed that entered the province, even though it wasn't on our weed list. Do you want to talk about that one? Do you remember Devil's Trumpet?
Oh, yeah, Jimson weed.
Yeah.
So Jimson weed, it was believed it came in a shipment of canola seed.
Mm-hmm.
So now with international travel, you get more movements of people. Some people bring seed in small packages and they pass customs. A lot of seed packages, CFIA may not regulate some weed seeds.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they get missed in the inspection process. So I am thinking that maybe a canola sample came in and this seed was spread with when the producer planted, and they found the Jimson weed growing in the field. Now this one was easy to identify because it's a taller plant than canola.
Right.
It's a poisonous weed that if cattle eats it, they can get sick or even die. So we want to make sure that these kind of weeds don't come into the province. And as I mentioned before, they can spread. So we do have, we are reviewing the weeds on the weed list right now.
Oh, yeah.
What fits. Yeah, and for the future, we do have Jimson weed listed. So for as a review, but it wouldn't happen in the near future. It would be down the road.
Well, I just thought it seemed to be a really good example of where the Weed Act worked very well, because it was an unknown plant that was identified and then it was eradicated. So everything went like it should have.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, a municipality can add it on their bylaw. That would happen relatively quickly. So if you guys find it in your municipality and you think, hey, we want people to control this, put it on a bylaw. So then if inspector finds it, they can let the landowner know that they need to control it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the whole weed list isn't usually changed around very often, is it?
No, it's not. Right now, we do have 75 weeds on the list, and
Quite a lot.
yes, so we're in the process of doing a review just to see where things fit. The Weed Act, the updated Weed Act got proclaimed in 2010. So time flies. It's
Yeah.
21 now. That's 11 years. So we're looking at each weed individually, working with the ag fieldman, and later probably working with some of the urban guys, just to see what they think, where these weeds fit. Do they still belong in the Weed Act? Are they prohibited noxious? Is it spread too far? Something like orange hawkweed or
Right.
knapweeds, do they still belong as prohibited noxious? And we do have aquatic weeds, flowering rush, they're in the water. Should it still be on the act? Things like that we're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what about the Pest Act? Those things tend to be a little more mobile.
Yes. So again, the purpose of the Pest Act is similar to the Weed Act. So it's to prevent pests and nuisances from entering the province. And a pest or a nuisance could be an animal, a bird, an insect, a plant, or a plant part that can harm agricultural production. So there's
or even a disease, right?
a disease. Sorry, yes, I forgot to mention the disease part. That's the big one.
Yeah.
People hear a lot about rats and clubroot and the nuisances of the like coyotes and skunks, so things like that. So a landowner has to take active certain measures to help prevent the introduction and spread of these pests, and the municipalities have the same responsibility to make sure these things are not getting into the province and not spreading.
So how does it, how easy or hard is it, the process to actually get something declared a pest under the Pest Act?
So that's a good question. To get something declared under the Pest Act, it has to show, it has to have a support from outside. So let's say the Fieldman are having a problem, pest that's not relatively established, something like, let's say, wild boar at large. And they would have to make a sort of a request, and then we would have to look at it. What we usually do is do a thorough scientific review just to make sure, see where this pest is located outside of the country, how much is it spread in the province, and would it survive in the province? So you might have something that survives in BC, but would it be able to survive the cold weathers in Alberta? So looking at things like that, if it does survive, how fast would it reproduce? What type of damages would it cost? And how much would it be to control it once it gets out of hand? So it looks at all those things. So we have to do what is called an environmental scan, and then consultation, collect all that information together, and then make a recommendation to the minister. And the minister has the power to make the regulations. It does take a while. It's a process that has to be followed. So it can be 6 months up to a year before things can be changed on the regulation.
Okay, I was wondering, did the marmorated stink bug go through that process? Because there was some that were detected a few years ago in red deer.
Yeah, I've heard of it, and we haven't really gotten a request from industry, or anyone hasn't really pushed hard for it. Marmorated stink bug is more a problem on fruit trees. And we don't have a lot of fruits here, so the horticultural industry hasn't really made a push for it. We haven't really had a big request. It's in the back of our mind, but we haven't evaluated it or made a push for it. Right now, we're looking at evaluating all the pests on the Pest Act. We've gone through 6 of them already and done a full evaluation. So we still have a little bit of ways to go.
Yeah, because I remember that one, it came in on some recreational vehicles from Tennessee. And I do believe our provincial or one of the entomologists at the time was doing some studies to see if they survived, but it looked like they couldn't survive the winters. Winter does have a value, you know.
Yeah, so maybe that's why it never went forward.
Yeah, I think there was some actual research looking to see about, they had traps up the following year with the pheromones and they didn't catch anything, so.
So, yeah, and I know there's other programs that do have traps for insects. So we do have a few insects on the Pest Act, and they're dealing with like Dutch elm disease, and there's the small hive beetle. Sorry, not the small hive beetle. There's a beetle that lives in grain. I forgot the name of it now. So
There's a bunch of longhorn beetles. Are they on the list?
No, the Asian longhorn, I don't think it's on the list right now. I think it's on the federal list, if I remember well, with the federal government, but we don't have it on the list. I'm just making sure here that I'm not telling you something that's not right, Harry.
Yeah, the longhorn beetles, Asian longhorn isn't on our provincial list. It's on the federal list. Yeah, same with emerald ash borer.
So how do those lists work? I guess the federal list would apply to the entire country, and then we would have, in addition to that, We then
Yes.
have our list of provincial pests.
Right, but we do have some provincial federally listed pests on the pest nuisance control regulations too.
Mhm.
As again Doug mentioned, so we do have a few insect pests like the gypsy moth and the lesser grain borer, as I mentioned. And then we do have the native elm bark beetle. Those are the ones for the Dutch elm disease.
Mhm.
So the Dutch elm disease is federally regulated, but we do have it on the list. If it's provincially legislated, then the ag fieldman can come in or the urban inspectors can come in and they would be having more surveillance for these kind of things if they're on the provincial list.
Because I was wondering, because you think of it, so you've got the Dutch elm beetle on the federal list, yet we have Dutch elm disease throughout most of Canada, stops at our border. So it's obviously having it on the federal list doesn't necessarily mean it's not here or that we've been successful in preventing it.
Yeah, they are on the federal list. The federal list, they have a similar goal as us, is to help prevent it from moving. So with the federal list, they have, it's mostly things like firewood. So you can't move the firewood from the restricted area to outside. And so I guess having it on our list, there's a society, Stop Dead. They put out bullets and pamphlets saying, don't move firewood around. If you have to use, let's say on a campsite, just use the local firewood that's around, because they don't want insects moving around in that sort of way.
No.
Yeah.
Well, seems to be working. I like the fact that it also, the Pest Act does give authority for controlling nuisance animals and such as well.
Yeah, so with the nuisances, farmers can opt to control a nuisance on their property, but you do have to get approval if you want to obtain, let's say, poisonous material or baits. And usually the ag fieldmen are the ones who distribute traps and baits and things like that. So you have to get approval, and there are certain forms listed on the pest and nuisance control regulation that lists these things. So, for example, Form 7 is a permit to control skunk on another person's land, and Form 8 is used for coyote and skunk control on a person's land that they own.
Right.
So,
well, it gives people that have real serious problems with some of these pests, it does give them the ability then to find a control measure that's effective.
yes, it's helpful in that way.
It's going to be interesting to see what happens with strychnine for Richardson ground squirrels, since that's coming to an end now.
Yes, that would be something we have to look into also.
Well, I mean, there is the farmer pesticide certification program that allows you access to phos toxin and gas toxin pellets, which would be an effective and hopefully a more environmentally friendly method of control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's always something out there. It's how effective and how well it works. So always have to make sure it's done in a safe manner.
And people get used to using the same control methods, and it's like, if you've got a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, right?
Exactly. And these chemicals go through a rigorous process. Every 10 years, the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, that's PMR, it's a federally regulated process where they look at all these chemicals, whether it be herbicide, insecticides, things like that.
Yeah.
And they do evaluations. So maybe they might have some studies where it shows that it's either bad for the environment, it might have some toxic residual effect, things like that they have to consider all the time.
Yeah, they're pretty careful about what they will renew, that's for sure.
Yeah, that is for sure.
Anything else you want to say about either the Weed Act or the Pest Act, Gayah?
I just wanted to say inspectors, they have the authority to go onto land at a reasonable hour. So I know a lot of questions come up, who are these people on my land and things like that. So inspectors, they can come in and look for insects, pests, disease, weeds. They can take samples. And so they can do that at a reasonable time. And usually they're looking at a lot of land and things like that. Sometimes they would try and contact the producer if they can before they go on, but they don't have to. Other thing I didn't mention on the Weed Act was if you do have seed cleaning plants in your municipalities, they need to be licensed every year. So you have to go in, and the weed inspector has to go in. Usually the seed cleaning plant has to make a request, and then the inspector goes in and inspects the property. They need to take samples, and then if everything is okay and the plant gets the 80% or higher rating, then they get inspected. And there's also mobile seed cleaning plants. And we get asked this question a lot because they
Are there many mobile plants in the province?
We don't know for sure how many there are, but there are a few. So if they're coming into your province, into your municipality, they don't have to get licensed in your municipality. They have to get licensed where they're located. So they don't need to get a license everywhere they go.
Okay, so what about the ones, if they're coming from out of province? Does that happen?
I don't know about that happening, but it might happen. But if they do come from out of province, they won't be licensed because they need to have an Alberta address. So they would be operating illegally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Gayah.
That's all I can think of, Harry.
Okay, well, I mean, if anybody needs to find you, I'm sure they can contact me to give you your numbers. And I appreciate your time, Gayah and Doug. And if anybody has questions, they can always give you a call.
Thanks, Harry.
Thank you very much. I appreciate this, and have a great day.